A poor rancher and his horse found a deserted cabin, but what was in the well changed his life forever. The wind howls across a lonely stretch of the Colorado highlands. A man with nothing left but his saddle and his faith stumbles on a cabin, its roof sagging, its cross leaning in the dust. He lowers a bucket into the forgotten well expecting water. Instead, he pulls up a locked cedar chest, holding deeds, a Bible, and a secret the railroad would kill to keep buried. As the church bell tolls and hoofbeats thunder, gunmen arrive led by the rancher's own estranged brother. Now, the fight isn't just for land, it's for justice, for family, for survival. But when the cabin burns and the law turns its back, will a poor rancher's faith be enough to save his people, or will the well that gave him hope cost him everything? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more Dylan Barrow. Slumped in his saddle as Gideon picked his way across the parched Colorado highlands. The late summer sun beat down mercilessly, baking me already. Thirsty land, his throat felt as dry as the cracked earth beneath his horse's hooves. The canteen at his hip sloshed with barely a swallow left. Not nearly enough for both him and his faithful mount Dot. He patted Gideon's sweaty neck. We'll find. Water soon, old friend. The horse's ears twitched at his voice, but kept plodding forward. Dylan could feel the animal's ribs through the saddle blanket. A stark reminder of how lean times had become. The memory of his depleted herd twisted in his gut like a knife. Just last spring, he'd had 50 head of prime cattle. Now, after months of drought and a devastating outbreak of fever, he was down to just 12 sickly animals. The banknote would come due soon, and he had nothing to show for all his years of hard work except calloused hands and aching back. "The Lord provides," Dylan muttered, though the words felt hollow in his parched mouth. His faith had taken as much of a beating as his fortunes lately. Still, something kept him moving forward, searching for what? Hope, maybe. Or at least enough water to see another sunrise dot by midday. The situation had grown dire. Gideon's steps were becoming unsteady, and Dylan's own head swam in the merciless heat. The sparse patches of grass they passed were brown and brittle, offering no sustenance. The few clouds that drifted overhead seemed to mock them, refusing to shed even a drop of precious rain. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks when they crested a ridge, and Dylan's heart leaped at what he saw below. There, nestled in a small grove of gnarly juniper trees, stood a cabin. The sight wasn't exactly welcoming. The fence around it leaned drunkenly, and the cabin itself listed to one side like a tired old man. But it was shelter, and where there were buildings, there might be water. What do you say we check it out, boy? Dylan guided Gideon down the slope, noting the thick weeds that choked what might once have been a vegetable garden. No smoke rose. From the stone chimney and the cabin's single window stared back at him like a blind eye. Dusty and dark, he dismounted stiffly, his boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. After securing Gideon to a fence post, Dylan approached the cabin's weathered porch. The wood groaned beneath his weight, protesting years of neglect. He hesitated at the door, manners ingrained since childhood making him want to knock, despite the obvious abandonment of the place. Instead, he pushed the door open, wincing at its loud complaint. The hinges clearly hadn't seen oil in years. Inside, the cabin was a single room, dim in the fading daylight. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that penetrated the grimy window. Cobwebs draped from the ceiling beams like tattered lace, and the air held the musty smell of long abandonment. A rough-hewn table dominated the center of the room, its surface thick with dust save for one rectangular clean spot. Dylan's eyes were drawn to the book that sat there, a Bible, its leather cover cracked and its pages yellowed with age. Something about that lonely Bible, left behind when everything else of value had been taken, touched something deep in Dylan's chest. He moved further into the cabin, his spurs jingling in the heavy silence. A broken-down bed frame stood in one corner, its rope supports long since rotted away. A few shelves lined the walls, empty except for a single tin cup and a rusted coffee pot. The fieldstone hearth was cold and filled with old ashes, but it seemed sound enough. The silence pressed in around him, but it wasn't threatening. Instead, it felt expectant, as if the cabin itself had been waiting for someone to return and breathe life back into its empty spaces. Outside, Gideon nickered softly. The sound snapped Dylan out of his reverie, reminding him of their immediate needs. He needed to find water and gather firewood before full dark. The temperature would drop quickly once the sun set. That was the way of the high country. To his relief, he discovered a hand-dug well behind the cabin, half hidden by overgrown sage. The rope was rotted and the bucket gone, but when he dropped a stone down, he heard the satisfying splash of water. It took some doing, but he managed to rig up his saddle rope and canteen to draw enough water for himself and Gideon. The horse drank deeply while Dylan gathered fallen juniper branches for a fire. By the time twilight painted the sky in deep purples and blues, he had a small blaze going in the hearth. The broken chimney drew well enough, carrying the smoke up and out into the gathering night. The fire's warm light pushed back the shadows, making the cabin feel almost homey. Dylan settled on his saddle blanket near the hearth, his back against the rough wall. The days of riding and worry had left him bone-weary, but something about this place eased some of the tension from his shoulders. Outside, a coyote called to its mates, and the wind whispered through the junipers. It was a lonely sound, but not an unfriendly one. He pulled off his hat, holding it in his lap as he bowed his head. The words came slowly, rusty from disuse. Lord, I ain't much for fancy prayers, but I'm grateful for this shelter. I reckon I could use some guidance about now. Been feeling mighty lost lately. He paused, throat tight with emotion. If you're still listening, well, I could sure use a sign about which trail to take from here. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing on the cabin walls. Dylan's eyes grew heavy as the warmth seeped into his tired muscles. Before sleep claimed him, he had this strange feeling that this wasn't just any random abandoned cabin he'd stumbled upon. Something about it felt right. Like the answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was making as he drifted off. The night wind continued its gentle song in the junipers. And somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called out in the darkness. The cabin silence wrapped around him like a worn but comfortable blanket, offering rest to a weary traveler who might, without knowing it, have finally found his way home. The morning sun pierced through gaps in the cabin's aging roof, casting thin ribbons of light across Dylan's face. He blinked awake, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of yesterday came flooding back as he sat up, his muscles protesting from sleeping on the hard floor outside. Gideon nickered a morning greeting. Dylan grabbed his hat and stepped onto the creaking porch, where the crisp mountain air cleared the last cobwebs from his mind. His horse stood patiently by the leaning fence, waiting for attention. "Morning, old friend," Dylan said, approaching with slow, steady steps. He ran his hands over Gideon's legs, checking for any swelling from yesterday's long ride. The horse seemed no worse for wear, though his coat needed a good brushing. "Let's get you sorted out." He spent the next hour tending to Gideon Curry, combing his coat, picking his hooves, and ensuring he had fresh water from his canteen. The simple routine of caring for his horse brought comfort, a reminder that some things remain constant even when the world felt uncertain. With Gideon settled, Dylan turned his attention to exploring the cabin yard. Waist-high weeds choked what must have been a garden plot, and fallen branches littered the ground. But beneath the neglect, he could see the bones of what had once been a proper homestead. Behind the cabin, something caught his eye, weathered. Board lying flat against the ground, partially hidden by sage brush. The shape seemed too regular to be natural. Dylan pushed aside the scratchy branches and found himself looking at what appeared to be a well cover, warped by years of sun and rain. Curiosity piqued. He knelt down and worked his fingers under the edge of the board. It resisted at first, then came free with a groan of protesting wood. The dark circle of the well opening gaped before him, its depths lost in shadow. Dylan retrieved The rope and bucket he'd rigged up yesterday, hoping to draw more water. The bucket descended into the darkness, the rope playing out through his calloused hands. Instead of the expected splash, he felt a solid thunk as the bucket struck something that definitely wasn't water. What in tarnation? He muttered, giving the rope an experimental tug. The bucket seemed to catch on whatever was down there. Dylan braced his boots against the well's stone rim and hauled back with all his strength. The rope creaked under the strain as he slowly drew up not just the bucket, but something much heavier. A cedar chest emerged from the well's depths, water streaming from its joints. Dylan's heart hammered against his ribs as he manhandled it, over the well's edge. The chest was about the size of a saddle box, its wood dark with age and moisture, but still solid. A rusted lock hung uselessly from its hasp, practically crumbling at his touch. With trembling hands, he pried open the lid. The hinges protested but held. Inside, protected by the chest's tight-fitting lid and oiled wood, lay a stack of documents. Dylan's breath caught in his throat as he lifted out the first yellowed paper, a land deed, dated 15 years prior. Not trusting his legs, he sat right there in the dirt and began examining his find. Besides the deeds, there were carefully drawn survey maps showing property boundaries and water sources. Most intriguingly, there was a small leather-bound Bible, clearly meant for a child. Pressed between its pages were dried flowers and many. Verses were underlined in careful pencil strokes. His hands shook as he realized what he was holding. These documents appeared to establish clear ownership of a spring that now lay under railroad control, the same railroad that had been buying up every water source in the territory, sometimes through means that folks whispered weren't entirely legal. Lord above, Dylan whispered, looking skyward. Was this God's answer to his prayer for guidance? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Despite the warming morning air, he gathered the chest in his arms and carried it into the cabin, settling it on the dusty table. His saddlebags yielded a meager breakfast of jerky and hardtack, but Dylan barely tasted it as he pored over the documents. The map showed the spring lying just 3 miles north of the cabin, in a narrow valley that he knew the railroad now. Claimed as its own, hours slipped by as he studied every detail. The deed seemed proper and official, bearing the territorial seal. If these documents were valid, they could change everything, not just for him, but for every rancher in the valley who depended on that water dot as evening approached. Painting the cabin's interior in amber light, Dylan allowed himself to dream. With legal claim to the spring, he might be able to ensure fair water access for all the local ranchers. He could rebuild his herd, maybe even earn enough too. His thoughts drifted to Mila Coulter, his widowed neighbor whose quiet strength and gentle faith had caught his attention months ago. He'd never felt right about approaching her. Not with his ranch failing and his future so uncertain. But now, with this providence, his heart quickened at the possibility of offering her something more than a struggling rancher's hard life. The sun sank behind the mountains, and Dylan finally set aside the documents. He'd need legal help too? Understand everything fully. But hope had taken root in his chest, something he hadn't felt in longer than he cared to remember Dot as he spread his bedroll near the hearth. Dylan carefully placed the cedar chest beside him. Its presence felt like a tangible sign that the Lord hadn't forgotten him after all. Sleep came easier than it had in months, despite the hard floor beneath him and the weight of decisions to come. 2 days of preparation had left Dylan's muscles aching, but he knew the journey into town couldn't wait. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin yard as he saddled Gideon, carefully securing the cedar chest behind the cantle. Every buckle and strap demanded extra attention from his weathered hands, stiff from years of ranch work. Easy there, boy, Dylan murmured as Gideon shifted beneath the unusual weight. The horse's ears flicked back at his voice, then forward again. Alert to the morning sounds of scrub jays and wind in the junipers, Dot the trail into town stretched before them like a dusty ribbon, winding through sage-dotted hills. Dylan kept Gideon to a steady walk, mindful of both the precious cargo and the horse's footing on the rocky ground. The cedar chest bumped gently against the saddle with each step. a constant reminder of its importance. Hours passed beneath the relentless Colorado. Son, Dylan's shirt grew damp with sweat, and dust coated his throat. He took careful sips from his canteen, remembering too many days when water had been scarce. The thought of the spring mentioned in those deeds made each swallow feel more meaningful. Shadows lengthened as they approached town near dusk. The main street lay quiet, though yellow lamplight already spilled from the saloon windows. A piano's tinny notes drifted on the evening air, along with the murmur of voices seeking refuge from another day's heat. Dylan guided Gideon toward the schoolhouse, a whitewashed building standing neat and proud at the edge of town. The horses' hooves clopped softly on packed earth as Dylan dismounted, his boots raising small puffs of dust. He tied Gideon to the hitching post, patting the horse's sweaty neck before retrieving the cedar chest. Miss Harding was known throughout the county for her precise mind and steady hand with both letters and numbers. More than once, she'd helped settlers understand complex documents or write important correspondence. Dylan had always admired how she treated everyone with the same careful attention. Whether they could read or not, he found her still at her desk, marking student papers in the fading light. The schoolroom smelled of chalk dust and pine soap, with rows of empty desks standing like silent sentinels. Miss Harding looked up at his entrance, her gray-streaked hair neat beneath her modest bonnet. "Mr. Barrow," she said, setting aside her pen. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "Miss Harding." Dylan removed his hat, suddenly aware of the trail dust coating his clothes. "I apologize for disturbing you so late, but I've found something that needs your expertise." He placed the cedar chest on her desk, and her eyebrows rose at its weathered condition. As Dylan explained its discovery, Miss Harding listened intently, her expression growing more focused with each detail. "Let me see these documents," she said, reaching for her reading glasses. The light was failing, so she lit an oil lamp, its warm glow falling across the yellowed papers as she began to read aloud. "This appears to be a properly filed deed," she said, voice clear and steady. "Dated 1873, with the territorial. Seal intact. The survey maps are professionally drawn with all the correct markings." She looked up at Dylan, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "Where did you say you found these?" Before Dylan could answer, a shadow fell across the schoolhouse door. A man stood there, his presence somehow both careful and commanding. Dylan recognized him as Nantan, the Apache scout who sometimes came to town to trade. He'd heard folks speak well of the man's fairness and wisdom. "Pardon the interruption," Nantan said, his English clear and measured. "I could not help but overhear about maps." He gestured to the documents. "May I?" Miss Harding looked to Dylan, who nodded. Nantan stepped forward, studying the survey maps with careful attention. His finger traced the marked spring's location, and something flickered in his dark eyes. "I know this place," he said quietly. "Many families depend on these waters, both settler and Apache. The gods blessed this spring. It flows even in the driest seasons." He looked at Dylan directly. "The railroad men, they put up fences now. Say the water belongs to them alone." Dylan felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper into his chest. These weren't just papers anymore. They represented people's lives, their ability to survive in this harsh land. He thought of his own struggling ranch, of other families facing the same hardships. "These deeds appear entirely legitimate," Miss Harding confirmed, still examining each document. "With these, you could challenge the railroad's claim legally." The night had fully fallen outside, and Dylan knew he should find a place to sleep. The livery stable offered clean hay in its loft for travelers, and Gideon would appreciate proper shelter. He carefully packed away the documents, thanking both Miss Harding and Nantan for their time. The livery's familiar smells of hay and horse welcomed them. Dylan made sure Gideon was comfortable in a stall before climbing the ladder to the loft. The cedar chest stayed close as he settled into the fresh hay, his saddle serving as a pillow. The day's events turned over in his mind as he drifted towards sleep. A sharp sound jolted him awake. Boots on packed earth, multiple sets. Dylan crept to the loft's edge and peered down through gaps in the boards. Lamplight spilled across the street as a group of armed moved through town. Their manner spoke. Of authority and threat in equal measure at their head walked a well-dressed man Dylan didn't recognize. But his bearing marked him as some kind of railroad agent. The others were clearly hired guns, their coat pockets heavy with revolvers. But it was the last man that made Dylan's heart stutter. Luke, his younger brother. The years had hardened Luke's face, turned his movements sharp and watchful. Gone was the easy smile Dylan remembered from their childhood. Now Luke carried himself, like the other gunmen, with that same coiled readiness for violence. Dylan pressed back from the edge, his breath coming quick and shallow. How had Luke ended up working for the railroad? The brother who'd once helped him tend cattle, who'd read from their mother's Bible on Sunday evenings. Now he stood with men who took water from those who needed it most. The sound of boots faded as the group moved down the street. Dylan lay back in the hay, but sleep had fled. His mind raced with questions and memories, while below, Gideon shifted restlessly in his stall, as if sensing his master's distress. The cedar chest pressed against Dylan's side, its contents somehow heavier. Now, whatever came next, he realized wouldn't just be about water rights. It would mean standing against his own brother, choosing between blood and what he knew was right. Dawn was still hours away, and Dylan Barrow had never felt more alone. The first pale light of dawn crept over the hills, painting the town in soft grays and muted gold. Dylan led Gideon from the livery, his boots crunching on the frost-touched ground. His mind still churned with the sight of Luke among the railroad men. Each step toward the creek felt heavy with memories of younger days, when he and his brother had worked side by side under the Colorado sky. The creek gurgled softly as Gideon lowered his head to drink. Dylan watched the ripples spread across the water's surface, distorting the early morning light. "What happened to you, Luke?" he whispered, more to himself than the cool morning air. Back in town, the streets began to fill with the usual morning bustle. Dylan kept the cedar chest close, tucked securely in his saddlebag. He'd just finished tying Gideon outside the general store when purposeful footsteps approached from behind. "Mr. Barrow." The voice was smooth as polished wood, but held an edge beneath its surface. "I believe you have something that belongs to the railroad." Dylan turned slowly. The railroad agent stood there in his fine eastern suit, Luke and two other armed men flanking him. The agent's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Those deeds you found," the agent continued, "they're railroad property. We'll take them now, with fair compensation for your trouble." Dylan's hand instinctively moved closer to his coat, where he'd transferred the most important papers. He studied his brother's face, searching for any trace of the boy who'd once shared his dreams. Luke's expression remained carefully blank, but something flickered in his eyes when they met Dylan's. "These papers were abandoned," Dylan said firmly, "and they show the spring belongs to the original homesteader, not the railroad." The agent's smile tightened. "Mr. Barrow, surely you understand the railroad's importance to this territory's future. We can't let old papers interfere with progress." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Things could become very difficult for a struggling rancher who doesn't cooperate." Movement caught Dylan's eye. Miss Harding stood in the schoolhouse doorway, watching intently. Near the trading post, Nantan leaned against the post, his presence steady and watchful. Their quiet support strengthened Dylan's resolve. "The deeds stay with me," Dylan said, meeting the agent's gaze. "If you want to discuss water rights, we can do it proper, in court." The agent's facade cracked for just a moment, revealing something. Cold beneath. "Luke," he snapped, "talk sense into your brother." Luke shifted his weight, gun belt creaking. "Dylan," he said, his voice rougher than Dylan remembered, "don't be stubborn. Take the money, like you took their money, Luke." The words came out before Dylan could stop them. Heavy with years of hurt, something raw crossed Luke's face, but he said nothing more. The agent glared at Dylan, all pretense of friendliness gone. "This isn't over," he warned, then turned sharply and strode away, his men following. Luke lingered for a moment, looking like he might speak. then shook his head and followed the others. Miss Harding approached once they'd gone. "You did right," she said softly. "Those papers could help a lot of families." Nanton joined them, his dark eyes serious. "The railroad men, they do not understand the water is life itself," he said. "It must be shared, not owned." Dylan nodded, grateful for their words, but knowing he needed to move quickly now. He gathered supplies from the store, then mounted Gideon for the ride back to the cabin. The morning sun had burned away the frost, promising another hot day. As they rode, Dylan found himself speaking aloud, his words carried away by the wind. "Lord," he prayed, "I ain't always understood your ways, but I reckon you led me to those papers for a reason. Give me the courage to do what's right by them." The cabin came into view by mid-afternoon, its weathered walls glowing in the sunlight. Dylan wasted no time unloading his supplies and setting to work. He cleared tangles of brush from around the yard, the physical labor helping to settle his troubled thoughts. The roof needed patching in several places, and he carefully nailed new shingles over the worst spots. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills. The sound of wagon wheels made him pause. His heart quickened when he recognized Milla. Coulter's wagon approaching through the golden light. She sat straight and sure on the wagon seat, her dark hair neat beneath her bonnet, a covered basket beside her. "Evening, Dylan," she called, bringing the wagon to a stop. "Heard some interesting talk in town today?" Dylan helped her down from the wagon, very aware of her small hand in his. "Word travels fast," he said. "Brought you some supper," she said, reaching for the basket. "Thought you might need it, taking on the railroad and all." Her smile held warmth and something that might have been pride. Together they carried her offerings inside, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and a pot of fragrant stew that made Dylan's stomach remember he'd barely eaten all day. He lit the lamp while Mila set out 2 tin plates, its gentle glow softening the cabin's rough edges. They sat at the old table, the evening air cooling through the open door. Dylan found himself telling her everything, finding the chest, discovering Luke's involvement, the agent's threats. Mila listened intently, breaking the bread and sharing it as he spoke. "Sometimes the hardest thing is standing alone," she said softly, understanding in her eyes. "After Thomas passed, I thought I couldn't bear it. But the good Lord sends help in unexpected ways." Dylan nodded, touched by her words. The stew was rich and warming, but he felt an even deeper warmth from her presence, her quiet strength. Here was someone who understood loss, yet chose hope. "The spring could help so many," he said. "Settlers, Apache families, anyone trying to make a life here. Seems like that's worth fighting for." "Yes," Mila agreed, her face gentle in the lamplight. "It is." After supper, she insisted on helping him wash the dishes before leaving. Standing in the doorway, she touched his arm lightly. "You're not alone in this, Dylan Darrow," she said, then climbed into her wagon and headed home through the gathering dusk. Dylan stayed up late that night, reading by lamplight. He'd found the child's Bible in the cedar chest, its pages marked, with careful underlines. One passage caught his eye. "Be strong and of good courage. Fear not, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord thy God, he it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee." The words seemed to speak directly to his situation. Dylan ran his finger along the faded underline, wondering about the person who had marked it years ago. Someone else who had needed courage, perhaps. Someone else who had stood alone. Outside, a coyote called lonely in the distance. Dylan closed the Bible gently, its promises settling into his heart like seeds waiting to grow. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in soft pinks and golds as Dylan surveyed the cabin's weathered walls. Armed with determination and a handful of rusty nails, he set to work replacing broken boards on the porch. Gideon watched from his temporary pen, occasionally nickering at passing birds. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when the first wagon approached. Old Jim Cooper pulled up in his creaking cart, his white beard catching the light. "Heard you might need some spare lumber," Jim called out, gesturing to the stack of boards in his wagon. "Had these taking up space in my barn." Dylan wiped his brow, touched by the unexpected kindness. "Much obliged, Jim. That's mighty generous of you." "Ain't nothing," Jim replied, helping Dylan unload the boards. "Figure any man willing to stand up to the railroad deserves a bit of help. As the morning stretched toward noon, more neighbors arrived. Sarah Williams brought a bucket of nails and her teenage son's strong backs. The Miller family came with spare hinges and a window pane. Each visitor carried not just supplies, but stories of their own struggles with drought and the railroad's tight grip on water rights. Nantan arrived on foot around midday, leading his paint horse loaded with fence posts. He worked steadily alongside Dylan, their shared labor needing few words. As they mended the broken corral, Nantan spoke of the spring's importance. "The water flows for all," he said, tamping earth around a post. "Like the sun shines on every plant. My people have shared this spring with settlers for many seasons." He paused, dark eyes serious. "The railroad men, they do not understand this way." Dylan nodded, thinking of the greed he'd seen in the agent's eyes. "Reckon some folks can't see past their own profit." They worked through the warm afternoon, the cabin slowly shedding its abandoned look. Dylan's muscles ached, but his heart felt lighter with each improvement. The sound of hammers and friendly voices filled the air that had been so silent just days before dawn. As evening approached, a familiar wagon rattled the trail. Mila sat straight and sure on the seat, her dark hair tucked neatly beneath her bonnet. Beside her lay a wooden toolbox, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Dylan helped her down, trying not to notice how her hand felt in his or how her eyes sparkled with purpose. "These were Thomas's," she said, reaching for the toolbox. "Been gathering dust in my shed. They ought to be doing honest work again." Dylan started to protest, but Mila fixed him with a gentle yet firm look. "Thomas would have wanted them used for something good," she said softly. "Please." He nodded, understanding the gift was about more than tools. It was Mila's way of investing. In hope of believing in what the cabin could become. As the day's helpers began heading home, Mila set up her cooking pot over a small fire. The aroma of beans and cornbread soon drew everyone who remained. They sat on upturned buckets and newly mended porch steps, sharing the simple meal and easier conversation than the territory had known in months. Gideon, seeing his chance, ambled over and stuck his nose straight into the cooking pot. Mila's surprised laugh rang out, clear and bright as a bell. Dylan had to grab the horse's halter, trying to maintain a stern face while everyone chuckled at Noel's unrepentant expression. "Guess even the horses know good cooking when they smell it," Sarah Williams said, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of work and fellowship. Each sunrise brought new improvements to the cabin, and each sunset left Dylan more certain he'd found his true purpose. The roof stopped leaking, the windows gleamed, and fresh whitewash brightened the walls. Inside, Mila helped arrange simple curtains and set sprigs of wildflowers in tin cans. When Sunday arrived, the cabin yard filled with wagons and saddle horses. Neighbors arrived carrying rough-hewn benches and quilts to sit upon. Dylan had swept the cabin's wooden floor clean and set chairs in neat rows, standing before the gathered faces. Dylan held the child's Bible from the cedar chest. His voice grew stronger as he read the marked passages about justice and hope. Looking out at the crowd, settlers and Apache alike listening intently, he saw the possibility of a different future. One where water flowed freely and neighbors helped the neighbors. No matter their differences, Mila sat near the front, and when Dylan finished reading, she began to hum softly. The hymn was old and familiar, speaking of grace in hard times. Soon other voices joined in, filling the cabin with harmony. The children seated on the floor leaned forward, some sing along, others watching with wide eyes as their community found its voice together. Dylan felt something shift in his heart, like winter ice finally breaking in spring. The cabin wasn't just shelter anymore. It was becoming a gathering place, a symbol of what they could build together. For the first time since losing his herd, he felt truly rich. The peaceful moment shattered when someone noticed movement at the edge of the gathering. Luke sat on his horse in the lengthening shadows, watching. His expression was unreadable, but his presence sent a chill through the warm afternoon. Doc, the singing, faltered. Parents drew their children closer. Dylan took a step toward his brother, but Luke had already turned his horse away. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only dust hanging in the air and questions hanging in Dylan's mind. As the neighbors gathered their things to leave. The earlier joy felt dampened but not destroyed. Mila touched Dylan's arm gently. He'll have to choose his own path, she said softly, just like we all do. Dylan nodded, watching the last wagons roll away through the golden evening light. The cabin stood transformed behind him, no longer a place of emptiness, but one of possibility. Yet his heart remained unsettled, divided between hope for the future and worry about what Luke's appearance might mean. The morning dawned crisp and clear, with dew sparkling on the juniper branches. Dylan stepped out of the cabin, stretching, muscles sore from a week of repairs. He stopped short. There at the corral, Luke sat atop his bay horse, waiting. The brothers' eyes met across the yard. Dylan's hand instinctively moved toward his belt, but Luke raised both palms, showing they were empty. "Ain't here for trouble," Luke called out. His voice carrying on the morning air. Dylan approached slowly, studying his younger brother's face. The hard lines were still there, but something had shifted in Luke's eyes. A shadow of the boy he'd once been. "What brings you out this early?" Dylan asked, keeping his tone neutral as he reached the corral fence. Luke dismounted, his spurs jingling against the packed earth. He glanced around before speaking, voice low. "Come to warn you, Dylan. Railroad's got plans. Bad ones." Dylan's jaw tightened. More threats. Worse. Luke ran a hand through his hair. A nervous gesture Dylan remembered from their childhood. "They're bringing in dynamite. Mean to blow the spring rather than let anyone else have it." The words hit Dylan like a physical blow. They'd destroy God's gift. Leave folks without water out of pure spite. Ain't about spite to them. It's business. Luke's face twisted with something like shame. "There's more you should know. Those survey maps they're using, I helped falsify them, change boundary lines, moved markers. My hand that did it." Dylan gripped the corral post, feeling the rough wood bite into his palm. The admission hung heavy between them. "Why tell me this now?" Dylan asked. "Because I can't sleep nights anymore," Luke replied, his voice cracking. "Because Mama and Papa raised us better than this. Because every time I ride past that spring, I hear Papa's voice saying water's sacred, meant for all God's creatures." Dylan studied his brother's face, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped under a visible weight. "Then help me stop them. Do what's right." Luke shook his head, already backing toward his horse. "I've said more than I should. Just watch yourself. Railroad don't play fair." Before Dylan could respond, Luke swung into his saddle and spurred his horse away. Dylan watched until horse and rider disappeared into the morning haze, his heart heavy with both hope and worry for his brother's soul. Later that morning, Mila arrived with her wagon and empty barrels for the daily water haul. Dylan helped her hitch up the team, telling her about Luke's visit as they worked. "Lord have mercy," Mila breathed, adjusting her bonnet against the strengthening sun. "They'd really destroy the spring?" "Luke wouldn't lie about that," Dylan said, checking the barrel straps. "Not anymore." They set out for the spring, the wagon creaking beneath them. Mila handled the reins while Dylan sat lost in thought, the morning's conversation weighing on his mind. "You still trust him?" Mila asked softly. "After everything?" Dylan considered carefully before answering. "Reckon trust is like a rope bridge. Takes courage to step out on it, especially after it's been cut once. But sometimes you got to try." Mila nodded, her eyes on the trail ahead. "My Thomas used to say forgiveness isn't about forgetting the hurt. It's about choosing to love anyway." They reached the spring in comfortable silence. As they worked together, filling the barrels, Mila spoke again, her voice tight with worry. "Sometimes I wake up scared. Dylan, the railroad's got money, guns, power. What chance do simple folks like us have against that? Dylan paused in his work, water dripping from the bucket in his hands. Remember David and Goliath? Ain't about who's biggest. It's about standing firm in what's right. And if they come with dynamite, then we'll face that too. Dylan met her eyes. I aim to protect this spring, Mila. For all of us. No matter what comes. Something passed between them in that moment. Understanding, perhaps, or something deeper. Mila's cheeks flushed slightly as she turned back to her work, but a small smile played at her lips. The sun was setting when they returned to the cabin, casting long shadows across the yard. Already, wagons were arriving for the evening gathering, bringing food and fellowship. Sarah Williams had her famous bean pot the Miller family brought, fresh baked bread, and Jim Cooper arrived with his fiddle tucked under one arm. Soon the cabin yard hummed with conversation and laughter. Children chased fireflies while their parents shared news and concerns. Apache families mingled with settlers, united by their common need for water and justice. The aroma of coffee and warm bread filled the cooling air. Dylan watched it all from the porch steps, his heart full. This was what the cabin was meant to be, not just shelter, but sanctuary. A place where hope could take root and grow. Mila appeared beside him, offering a tin cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed as he took it, sending a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the drink. She settled next to him on the step, close enough that he could smell the lavender water she used to press her dress. Look at them all, she said softly. All these people choosing to stand together. It's beautiful. Dylan nodded, sipping his coffee, like a garden coming up after drought. As darkness gathered, Jim Cooper struck up a tune on his fiddle. Others joined in with guitar and harmonica, and soon the yard filled with music. Mila's voice rose clear and sweet above the others, singing old hymns of deliverance and grace. Dylan felt something rising in his chest, not just faith, though that was part of it. Something warmer, something that made his heart beat faster. When Mila's shoulder brushed his as she swayed to the music. But even as joy filled the gathering, danger lurked at its edges. In the deepening shadows beyond the lamplight, two figures on horseback watched. Railroad men, their faces hard in the darkness, their intentions clear in the way they gripped their rifle stocks. Dylan noticed them first, then others began to see. The music gradually faded as parents gathered their children closer. The warm fellowship of moments before cooled under the weight of watchful eyes. The railroad men finally rode away, but their presence left a chill that even the dying campfire couldn't warm. As neighbors began heading home, hugging close and speaking in low voices, Dylan helped Mila into her wagon. You be careful riding home, he said, holding her gaze. You too, she replied softly. I'll be back tomorrow. Dylan stood in the yard long after the last wagon disappeared, listening to the night sounds. Crickets chirped, an owl called, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes yipped at the rising moon. But underneath it all, he sensed trouble brewing. Dark as storm clouds on the horizon, he checked Gideon one last time before heading inside, making sure the horse was secure for the night. The cabin felt empty after all the evening's fellowship, but Dylan could still hear echoes of hymns and laughter in its walls. Those sounds, and the memory of Mila's smile, would have to be enough comfort for whatever lay ahead. 3 days after the railroad men's threatening appearance, Dylan stood before his mirror in the cabin, adjusting his best shirt. The sun had barely risen, but determination burned in his eyes. Today he would take their cause to town proper before the council itself. Reckon it's time, he told Gideon, while saddling him. The horse nickered in agreement, sensing his rider's resolve. Mila arrived first, her wagon wheels crunching on the morning frost. She wore her finest dress, though it was several years out of fashion. Her face glowed with purpose as she climbed down. Brought you something, she said, holding out a pressed handkerchief. For luck. Nantan rode up shortly after, his horse's hooves silent on the packed earth. He dismounted with fluid grace, nodding to them both. The people are watching, he said simply. Both my people and yours. The three of them made quite a sight riding into town, Dylan on Gideon, Mila beside him in her wagon, and Nantan bringing up the rear. Morning sun caught the dust their passage stirred, turning it to golden mist. Main Street was already stirring when they arrived. Shopkeepers paused in their sweeping to watch them pass. A group of children stopped their play, pointing and whispering. Even the telegraph operator stepped outside his office. Squinting at their approach, the town hall stood 2 stories tall, its weathered boards yearning for fresh paint. Dylan helped Mila down from her wagon, then squared his shoulders. The deeds felt heavy in his coat pocket as they climbed the steps. Inside, the council chamber smelled of tobacco and old wood. Sheriff Mills sat at the head table, flanked by 5 councilmen. Their faces were carefully blank, but Dylan noticed how they shifted in their seats, how their eyes darted to the railroad agent standing in the corner. Well, now, Sheriff Mills drawled, "What brings you folks to council today?" Dylan stepped forward, laying the deeds on the table. "Got something here needs official attention, Sheriff. Legal documents proving rightful ownership of Morgan Spring." The sheriff barely glanced at the papers. "That's so. These deeds are properly filed." Dylan continued, his voice steady. "Show clear title to both land and water rights. Spring's been serving both settlers and Apache families for generations. Railroad's got no right to claim it." One of the councilmen, Jacob Porter, cleared his throat. "Serious accusation, Barrow. Railroads got their own surveys and documents." "Falsified ones," Mila spoke up, her chin lifted. "And you all know it?" A murmur ran through the growing crowd at the chamber's back. More townspeople had filtered in, drawn by word of the confrontation. The sheriff's face hardened. "Now, see here." "No." "You see here?" Dylan cut in, laying his hand flat on the deeds. "These papers tell truth. That spring's water belongs to all God's children, not railroad profit. Law's supposed to protect that truth, ain't it?" Nantan stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "My people have shared those waters in peace for many seasons. The spirits of our ancestors watch this place. Will you honor truth or turn away?" The council members exchanged uneasy glances. The railroad agent pushed off from his corner, moving to speak, but before he could, more. Voices rose from the crowd. "Hear him out. Let's see them papers proper. Railroad's been pushing us all around too long." Sheriff Mills rapped his knuckles on the table. "Order! This here's a proper council meeting." He glared at Dylan. "We'll take these claims under advisement. Need time to study everything proper like." "Meaning?" "You'll delay until the railroad gets what it wants," Miller said clearly. More voices of support rose from the crowd. Dylan saw faces he recognized. Sarah Williams from the general store, Jim Cooper the fiddle player, Thomas Reed who ran the livery. Good people, tired of being pushed aside. The sheriff's face reddened. Meeting adjourned. "We'll announce our decision when we're good and ready." But as they left the hall, Dylan knew something had shifted. People clustered around them, offering words of encouragement and support. The telegraph operator promised to spread word to other towns. Sarah Williams declared she'd stop serving. Railroad met at her store. "They can't ignore us all," Jim Cooper said, gripping Dylan's shoulder. The rest of the week passed in a blur of activity. More families visited the cabin, bringing food and offers of help. Apache riders came too, speaking long into the evening with Nantan about water rights and shared lands. Sunday dawned clear and bright. By mid-morning, wagons and riders filled the cabin yard. Children played between the wheels while their parents spread blankets on the grass. Apache families sat together with settlers, sharing food and stories. Dylan stood on his porch steps, heart full at the sight. Mila pressed close to his side as he raised his hands for attention. "Folks," he called. Out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Reckon you all know why we're here. That spring's more than just water. It's life itself. God put it there for all his children, not for railroad profits." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I aim to defend it," Dylan continued. "For my neighbors, for the Apache families who've shared it peaceful like all these years, for our children's children yet to come. But I can't do it alone." "You ain't alone," someone shouted. Others took up the cry. Dylan felt Milla's hand slip into his. He looked down to see tears shining in her eyes, but they were tears of joy and pride. The crowd's voices rose in support. Settler and Apache alike, united in purpose. Sarah Williams started a hymn, her clear voice lifting above the murmur. Others joined in, the music swelling until it seemed to fill the valley. Dylan felt lifted by it, as if all the broken pieces of his life were finally coming together in this moment. The afternoon passed in a celebration of community. Children played games while their parents shared news and plans. Apache youth demonstrated traditional dances, then taught settler children the steps. The air filled with laughter and hope. As evening approached, most folks headed home, leaving behind promises of support and prayers. Soon only Miller remained, helping Dylan clean up while supper simmered on the stove. "Never thought I'd see such a gathering here," she said, setting plates on the table. "Feels like a miracle. Miracle." Dylan smiled, dishing up beans and cornbread. "Reckon sometimes the good Lord works through plain folks standing together." They ate by lamplight, their conversation easy and warm. Mila told stories about her garden, and Dylan shared tales of his early ranching days. Their laughter rang natural and free, filling the cabin with joy. After supper, Dylan stepped outside to pray beneath the stars. The night air carried the scent of sage and juniper, and somewhere an owl called softly. He whispered his thanks to God for this day, for the support of neighbors, for Mila's gentle presence, for hope restored. But across the valley, beyond his sight, firelight flickered in the darkness. Hired men gathered around their campfires, checking weapons and explosives, waiting for orders to destroy what they could not control. The night settled deep and quiet over the cabin. Dylan lay on his bedroll near the hearth, where embers still glowed softly from the evening's fire. The deeds and documents rested safely in the cedar chest beside him, and the child's Bible lay within arm's reach. Gideon's occasional snorts drifted in from the corral, familiar and comforting. Sleep came, fitfully. Dreams of smoke and shadow plagued him, until a desperate sound cut through his restless slumber. Gideon's frantic neighing, high and terrified. Dylan's eyes snapped open. Orange light flickered through the cabin windows, too bright for dawn. Then he smelled it, smoke. Thick and choking, it rolled across the ceiling in dark waves. He scrambled to his feet, lungs burning. Flames were already climbing the outside walls, their hungry crackling growing louder by the second. Heat pressed against him like a physical force as he stumbled to the cedar chest. "Lord help me," he gasped, yanking the precious deeds free. Smoke stung his eyes, bringing tears that streamed down his face. The child's Bible, he grabbed that too, clutching both to his chest. The door was hot to the touch. Dylan kicked it open, ducking low as flames roared through the gap. Outside, Gideon reared against his lead rope, eyes rolling white with terror. Coughing and staggering, Dylan made it to the corral. His trembling fingers fought with the knot until Gideon was free. The horse pressed against him, shaking. As they retreated to safer ground. From there, Dylan could only watch. The fire devoured his dreams with terrifying speed. Flames leaped from wall to wall, setting the roof ablaze. The heat was intense enough to force them further back, until they stood at the edge of the property. Hoofbeats thundered in the pre-dawn. Darkness. Neighbors arrived, drawn by the glow against the night sky. Men shouted and women cried out, but it was already too late. The cabin was fully engulfed. Dylan. "Oh, merciful heaven." Mila's voice cut through the chaos. She leaped down from her wagon and ran to him, taking his soot-blackened hands in hers. "Are you hurt?" "We saw the flames from my place, came fast as we could." He could only shake his head, throat too tight for words. Together they watched the roof cave in with a tremendous crash, sending sparks spiraling up into the dark sky. More riders arrived. Thomas Reed, Jim Cooper, Sarah Williams, others who'd stood with him just hours before. But now fear showed plain on their faces as they witnessed destruction's aftermath. "Railroad men?" Thomas muttered, gripping his rifle. "Had to be." Sarah Williams wrung her hands. "If they do this, what else might they do?" Jim Cooper wouldn't. Meet Dylan's eyes. "Got my family to think about," he said quietly. Can't risk. One by one, they drifted away. Even those who cheered loudest yesterday now turned their backs, afraid of railroad vengeance. By sunrise, only a handful remained. Morning light revealed the full extent of the devastation. Where hope had lived now stood only a blackened skeleton of logs and stone. The neat yard was trampled, the repairs undone. Ashes drifted like gray snow, coating everything in defeat. Gillen's legs gave out. He sank to his knees in the dirt, still clutching the smoke-damaged Bible and deeds. The papers had survived, but what good were they now? His dream of building something meaningful lay in ruins, scattered like the ashes floating on the morning. Breeze? Why, Lord, he whispered. Why give hope just to snatch it away? Mila knelt beside him, her hand warm on his shoulder. But even her gentle presence couldn't ease the crushing weight in his chest. God felt distant, silent. The faith that had sustained him through drought and loss now seemed as fragile as the charred timbers of his destroyed home. Nantan approached, his face grave. The railroad men think to break your spirit, he said softly. They do not understand that a man's spirit, like water, cannot be owned or destroyed. But Dylan barely heard him. The morning passed in a haze of grief. Well-meaning folks tried to help, clearing debris, offering shelter. He refused them all. As the sun climbed higher, the last neighbors reluctantly departed, leaving him alone. With his despair, Mila was the last to go, tears in her eyes. Please, she begged, come stay at my place. Don't remain here alone. Dylan shook his head. Need to stay, he managed. Just need to stay. Evening found him still there, sitting in the ashes of his dreams. He'd fashioned a crude camp from what little survived, his saddle for a seat, a blanket that had been in the barn. The charred Bible lay in his lap. Its pages rippled from smoke and water. Gideon stood nearby, head lowered, occasionally touching, his nose to Dylan's shoulder as if to remind him he wasn't entirely alone. The horse's soft whickering was the only sound besides the whisper of wind through the burned timbers. Dylan stared at the ruins, remembering how it had looked just yesterday. Children playing in the yard, neighbors sharing food and song, hope rising like a hymn. Now only ashes remained, bitter on his tongue. The deeds sat beside him, edges scorched but still legible. They represented justice, truth, the right thing. But what good was right against men who'd burn a man's home while he slept? Who'd destroy rather than share God's gifts? Night settled over the devastation. Dylan couldn't sleep, though exhaustion weighed heavy on his shoulders. He clutched the smoke-stained Bible, trying to find comfort in its familiar verses. But the words blurred before his eyes. The moon rose, casting silver light on the ruins. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote wailed, a lonely sound that echoed the emptiness in Dylan's heart. Gideon shifted restlessly, pawing at the ground. What now? Dylan whispered to the night, what's left to fight for? But only silence answered. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant as his prayers. In the ashes of his dreams, hope itself seemed to have burned away. Leaving nothing but bitter dust and the taste of defeat. Morning light crept across the ruins of the cabin, casting long shadows through the burned timbers. Dylan stood among the ashes, his boots leaving dark prints in the gray dust. His eyes were hollow from lack of sleep, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Gideon followed close behind, the horse's presence steady and familiar in the desolate scene. Charred wood crackled under his feet as he made his way through what had been the main room. Here and there, bits of his brief dream remained. A half-melted tin cup, the scorched corner of a quilt, nails that had held pictures now gone to ash. Each remnant twisted like a knife in his heart. The morning wind carried the acrid smell of burned wood, making his eyes water. Or perhaps it wasn't the smoke at all. Dylan wiped his face with a grimy sleeve. Leaving a dark smudge across his cheek. His feet carried him toward the corral, where the wooden cross still stood. It leaned slightly now, scorched at its base, but remained upright, a silent witness to both destruction and endurance. Dylan's knees gave way before it, the hard earth pressing against his bones as he knelt. Lord? he whispered, voice rough from smoke and unshed tears. I don't understand your purpose here. Everything I built, everything you seemed to provide. The charred Bible lay heavy in his coat pocket. With trembling fingers he drew it out, carefully opening to where a loose page marked with a child's careful script had caught his eye during his first night in the cabin. The words were smudged but still readable. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Gideon's soft muzzle pressed against his shoulder, the horse's warm breath stirring his hair. Dylan reached up automatically to stroke the animal's nose, drawing comfort from the simple touch. The words on the page seemed to take on new meaning as he read them again. Be still, he murmured. The morning air grew quiet, as if nature itself was listening. Even Gideon stood motionless, ears pricked forward. The sound of wagon wheels broke the silence. Dylan looked up to see Milla's familiar rig approaching, the morning sun catching in her dark hair. She pulled up near the corral, her face etched with concern as she climbed down. I brought you something to eat, she said, softly, lifting a bundle wrapped in clean cloth from the wagon seat. The smell of fresh bread cut through the lingering smoke. Dylan started to refuse, but his stomach betrayed him with a loud growl. A ghost of a smile touched Milla's lips as she unwrapped the food, bread still warm from her oven, dried beef, and apples from her cellar. You need your strength, she insisted, pressing the bundle into his hands. Her fingers lingered on his, warm and steady. This isn't the end, Dylan, not unless you let it be. He looked down at the food, then back at the ruins. Maybe it should be. Look what fighting got us, nothing but ashes. No. Mila's voice was firm. It got us truth. It got us neighbors standing together, even if some have fallen away. It got U.S. She paused, color rising in her cheeks. It got us here, together. Before Dylan could respond, hoofbeats announced another arrival. Nantan rode up on his paint pony, dismounting with fluid grace. The Apache scout's dark eyes took in the destruction, his face grave but thoughtful. The district judge arrives next week, Nantan said without preamble. He holds court in Milton Springs, 2 days' ride from here. Unlike the town council, he cannot be bought with railroad gold. Dylan's heart quickened despite himself. The district judge? Nantan nodded. A man known for fairness, even to my people. The deeds would speak loud in his court. It would mean facing Luke, Dylan said quietly. Facing the railroad in open court. Yes, Nantan's gaze was steady. But not alone. The day stretched on, sun climbing high overhead. Dylan found himself sharing the bread and beef with Milla and Nantan, the simple act of breaking bread together somehow easing the weight in his chest. They spoke of practical things. The ride to Milton Springs, the preparations needed, the witnesses who might still stand with them as afternoon faded toward. Evening, Nantan rode out to spread word among those who might testify. Dylan and Milla sat together on a fallen log, watching the sunset paint the burned cabin in shades of gold and purple. I'll stand with you, Milla said suddenly, her voice soft but determined. In court, and after whatever comes. Dylan turned. To look at her, really look at her. The setting sun caught the silver threads in her dark hair, the quiet strength in her face. Something stirred in his chest, different from the earlier despair. Why? He asked. Why risk everything for this? Fight? Milla was quiet for a long moment. Because it's right, she said finally. Because this land needs people willing to stand for what's right no matter the cost. Because she met his eyes. Because I believe in you, Dylan Barrow. The simple declaration hung in the twilight air between them, full of unspoken meaning. Dylan found himself reaching for her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if they'd done this 1,000 times before as darkness settled over the land. Milla reluctantly departed for her own ranch. Dylan made his bed under the stars, using his saddle as a pillow. Gideon grazed nearby, the horse's quiet movements comforting in the night. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and clear. Dylan lay awake, but the hollow feeling in his chest had changed. In its place, something else was growing. Determination, Quiet but strong as an oak's roots, the child's Bible verse echoed in his mind. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Perhaps that stillness wasn't about giving up, but about finding the strength to stand firm. Perhaps it was about trusting that justice, like water, would find its way through any obstacle. His hand closed around the smoke-stained deeds beside him. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight, under God's stars, Dylan Barrow made his choice. He would fight, not with guns or fire, but with truth. Not alone, but surrounded by those who still believed. Mila with her quiet strength, Nantan with his wisdom, and perhaps even his lost brother Luke. If God's grace still worked in human hearts, sleep finally came, and with it, peace. The ruins of the cabin stood silent under the stars, but they no longer seemed like an ending. Instead, they felt like the beginning of something new, something built not of wooden nails, but of faith, courage, and love. Dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Dylan tightened Gideon's saddle straps. The horse nickered softly, sensing his rider's mix of determination and unease. Morning dew sparkled on the scorched timber of the cabin ruins, a reminder of all that had been lost and all that might yet be gained. The sound of approaching hooves made Dylan look up. Mila guided her sturdy bay mare into the yard, her dark hair neat beneath her riding hat, a determined set to her jaw. Behind her, Nantan appeared on his paint pony, silent as morning mist, nodding a grave greeting. The passes should be clear, Nantan said, dismounting to check his saddlebags. 2 days' ride to Milton Springs if we pace ourselves careful. Dylan patted the deeds, tucked safely in his coat pocket. Much obliged for riding with me, both of you. Ain't right to ask you to risk. We already decided, Mila cut in gently. No more talk of risk. The Lord guides our path. They set out. As the sun cleared the horizon, 3 riders moving steadily northward. The trail wound through rocky highlands, patches of scrub oak casting dappled shadows across their path. Gideon's hooves crunched steadily on loose stone, the familiar rhythm somehow steadying Dylan's nerves. The morning warmed slowly. They rode single file, Nantan leading, his keen eyes reading sign that Dylan could barely see. Mila rode in the middle, her quiet presence a comfort. Now and then, she would hum a hymn tune, the notes floating back to Dylan on the breeze. By midday, the sun beat down fierce. They paused in a grove of cottonwoods to rest the horses and share a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Dylan found himself watching Mila as she fed her mare an apple, the way sunlight caught the silver threads in her dark hair. The stream we seek lies 2 hours ahead, Nantan said, consulting the sun's position. Good water there, and shelter for the night. They rode on through the afternoon, the landscape growing more rugged. Twice, Nantan held up a hand for silence, listening intently, but nothing came of it. Still, Dylan felt watched, as if unfriendly. Eyes followed their progress from the rocky ridges above. The sun was lowering when they reached the stream, its clear water trickling over smooth stones. They made camp in a natural hollow, sheltered by old willows. While Nantan tended the horses, Mila built a small fire. Her sure movements speaking of long practice. After a supper of beans and coffee, they gathered close to the flames. The night, air carried a chill, and stars began pricking through the darkening sky. Mila drew out the child's Bible, its pages still smelling faintly of smoke. Shall I read? She asked softly. Dylan nodded, throat tight. Her voice rose clear and steady in the firelight, reading words of comfort and courage. The familiar verses washed over him like cool water, easing the knot of worry in his chest. Be strong and courageous, Mila read. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Dylan closed his eyes, letting the words sink deep. When he opened them again, he caught Mila watching him, her gaze soft with something more than firelight. And they bedded down with Nantan taking first watch. Dylan lay awake for a time, listening to night sounds, the stream's gentle voice, an owl's distant call, the horses shifting in their picket line. Sleep came easier than he'd expected. Morning brought frost on their blankets and a clear sky promising. He They ate quickly and rode out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The second day's trail grew steeper, threading through narrow passes where the horses' hooves echoed off stone walls. Near midday, Nantan reined in sharply, head cocked. A moment later, Dylan heard it too, the distant sound of multiple horses. Moving fast. Riders, Nantan said grimly. Behind us, maybe 6. Through gaps in the rocks, they caught glimpses of dust clouds rising from the back trail. Railroad men, Dylan knew in his gut, following them, likely hoping to stop them reaching the judge. "We push on," he said, voice firmer than he felt. "We've got the right of it, and God's help besides." They pressed their mounts as much as they dared on the rough trail. The dust clouds stayed behind them, neither gaining nor falling back. By late afternoon, the land began to open out, and ahead they saw Milton Springs sprawled in a wide valley. The town was larger than Dylan expected, with proper streets and brick buildings replacing the usual wooden structures. The courthouse rose above its neighbors, stern and solid as justice itself, its windows catching the last sunlight. Hooves clattered on packed dirt as they rode down the main street. A few townsfolk paused to watch them pass, but most went about their business. Dylan's heart pounded as they drew up before the courthouse steps. "I'll tend the horses," Nantan offered, gathering their reins. "Go. There's not much daylight left." Dylan helped Mila down from her saddle. Ben tied Gideon to the hitching rail. His legs felt wooden as he climbed the courthouse steps, Mila beside him. The heavy door creaked open into a cool, shadowed interior that smelled of dust and old paper. A clerk looked up from his desk, peering at them over wire-rimmed spectacles. "Court's nearly done for the day." "Please," Mila stepped forward. "We've ridden 2 days to file these deeds." "It's a matter of great importance." Something in her voice made the clerk hesitate, then nod. "Judge Harrison is still in his chambers. This way." They followed him down a narrow hallway, their boots quiet on the wooden floor. The judge's chamber door stood ajar, lamplight spilling. Out, Judge Harrison proved to be a tall man with iron-gray hair and keen eyes set in a weathered face. He listened carefully as Dylan explained about the deeds, the spring, and the railroad's threats. Serious accusations. The judge said finally, examining the documents with careful hands. "But these appear genuine, and the matter bears investigation." He made a note in a heavy ledger. "I'll hear the case in full tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Sharp, both sides will have their say." "Thank you, Your Honor," Dylan said, relief making his voice rough. "Don't thank me yet, young man," the judge warned. "Justice must follow its proper course. But I give you my word you'll have a fair hearing." They emerged from the courthouse into deepening twilight. Nantan waited with the horses, his face showing relief at their return. Behind him, distant, riders could be seen entering the far end of town. "We'd best find lodging," Mila said quietly. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." Dylan nodded, taking Gideon's reins. The weight of what lay ahead pressed on him, but somehow it felt lighter shared. Between the 3 of them, whatever the morning might bring, they had made it this far together. He looked up at the courthouse's solid walls, now dark against the evening sky. Somewhere in that building, the documents that could save the spring, and perhaps his soul waited for morning's light. For now, that would have to be enough. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Dylan sat rigid in his chair, aware of every creak and whisper in the packed room. "Judge." Harrison's gavel crashed down, bringing instant silence. "Court is now in session," the judge announced, his voice carrying to the farthest corner. "We're here to determine rightful ownership of Walker Spring and surrounding lands." Dylan's throat felt dry as sand as he approached the bench. He carefully laid out the recovered deeds, watching the judge examine each yellowed page. The documents looked fragile in the morning light, yet they carried the weight of so many hope. Miss Harding stepped forward next, her gray dress rustling. She held herself straight as a fence post, speaking with quiet authority about the deed's authenticity. "These documents bear proper seals and signatures," she explained, adjusting her spectacles. The dates and survey marks align with county records from 1862. In my 20 years of teaching, I've verified many legal papers. These are genuine. The railroad's lawyer, a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit, pressed her hard on dates and details. But Miss Harding stood firm, her responses clear and unhurried. When she finished, a murmur of approval rippled through the crowded room. Nantan rose next, his presence commanding respect. He spoke of the spring sacred importance, his words measured and deep. This water has sustained our people since before memory, he said. Our gardens depend on it. Our children drink there. The deer and elk come to these waters, as they have always done. This is not about ownership alone, about life itself. Dylan watched faces in the crowd soften as Nantan described generations of both settlers and Apache sharing the spring's blessing. Even the judge leaned forward, listening intently. The railroad's lawyer struck back like a rattler, his voice cutting. He waved thick folders of documents, speaking of progress and prosperity. These lands were abandoned, he declared. No claim was maintained. The railroad survey shows clear title, and we've invested thousands in development. Witnesses argued, back and forth through the morning. Homesteaders testified about water rights, their words sharp with worry. Railroad men spoke of contracts and progress, their tone dismissive of old claims, as the sun climbed toward noon. Tension filled the courthouse like summer heat before a storm. That was when the judge called Luke's name. Dylan's brother rose, slowly, from his seat near the railroad men. Luke's face was drawn, his eyes troubled as he took the oath. He stood at the witness stand, fingers working at his hat brim, caught between old loyalty and present duty. The court will recess for lunch, Judge Harrison announced, noting Luke's distress. We'll resume at 2 o'clock sharp. People filed out into the bright afternoon, talking in low voices. Dylan stumbled down the courthouse steps, his shirt damp with sweat. The morning strain left him feeling hollow as a dry well-dot Mila found him sitting alone on a bench in the shade of an old oak. She settled beside him, offering a tin cup of water and understanding in equal measure. What if it's not enough? Dylan whispered. What if, Luke, God never leaves us halfway? Mila said firmly, her hand finding his. Whatever comes next, he's with us through it all. Dylan held on to her words like a lifeline. They sat together, watching townsfolk hurry past until the afternoon. Shadows began to lengthen. That evening, after the long day in court, Dylan shared a simple supper with Mila and Nantan in the boarding house kitchen. Steam rose from thick coffee cups as they broke day-old biscuits, too tired for much talk. The weight of Luke's unspoken testimony hung over them like storm clouds. Nantan studied the dark liquid in his cup. Your brother must choose his own path, he said quietly. We can only pray he chooses well. Dylan nodded, grateful for the simple wisdom. Outside, a lone cricket chirped in the gathering dusk. Its song somehow hopeful in the silence. Morning light filtered through the courthouse windows. As Luke Barrow took the stand once more, his hands trembled as he gripped the wooden rail, looking first at his brother Dylan, then down at his boots. I need to tell the truth, Luke said, his voice cracking. I falsified those railroad survey maps. The company paid me to change the boundaries to hide the real ownership. He pulled a folded paper from his vest. This here's my original survey, showing the spring was never railroad land. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowded room. The railroad lawyer shot to his feet, face red with fury. These deeds Dylan found are genuine. I've known it all along. Luke's shoulders sagged with the weight lifting from them. I'm sorry, Your Honor. I'm sorry, Dylan. What I did was wrong. The railroad lawyer snatched up his papers and stormed out, boots echoing down the hallway. Judge Harrison called for order, then announced they would reconvene at sundown for his decision. Outside in the afternoon sun, Dylan found his brother slumped on the courthouse steps. Without hesitation, he pulled Luke into an embrace. Luke broke down, tears flowing freely as years of guilt poured out. Mila stood nearby, wiping her own eyes as she watched the brothers reconcile. Her heart swelled at God's grace made visible, That evening, they gathered in the inn's small parlor. Dylan's quiet prayer filled the lamplit room. Lord, thank you for bringing my brother home. Whatever comes tomorrow, we face it together. Luke and Mila added their own whispered amens as they waited for sundown. Hope and anxiety mingling in the growing shadows. Judge Harrison's gavel struck as the setting sun painted the courthouse windows in amber. The packed room held its breath as he adjusted his spectacles. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, this court finds the deeds presented by Mr. Dylan Barrow to be authentic and binding, the judge declared. The spring shall be restored to community use, with equal access guaranteed for both settlers and Apache families. Furthermore, the railroad company must reroute their planned track and pay damages for the cabin's destruction. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Mila threw her arms around Dylan, tears of joy streaming down her face. Nanton clasped Dylan's shoulder, nodding with quiet satisfaction. Luke stood apart, head bowed in humble acceptance of justice done right later that evening. The inn's dining room overflowed with celebrating townsfolk. Someone brought out a fiddle and hymns filled the warm air. Amazing Grace rose up from. Grateful hearts as neighbors who had once scattered in fear now stood united in victory. Your faith brought us through, Mila whispered to Dylan as they shared a quiet moment. You never stopped believing. Dylan's heart felt so full it might burst. The Lord fought for us, he said softly. We just had to stand still and trust. Outside, in the deepening dusk, Gideon's gentle nickering floated through the open window, as if the faithful horse shared in their joy. Dylan closed his eyes in gratitude, feeling the weight of loneliness and loss finally lifting from his shoulders. Weeks passed like gentle rain, washing away old hurts. The rebuilt cabin stood proud against the Colorado sky, its fresh-hewn boards gleaming in the sun. Dylan watched as Luke and the neighbors fitted the last shingle into place, their shared labor healing more than just the structure. The well, cleared of its secrets, now flowed sweet and clear. Gideon dipped his muzzle into the new wooden trough, water spilling over in silver ribbons. Children darted through the yard, their laughter mixing with Mila's soft hymn singing from the porch. Inside the cabin, neighbors gathered close as Nantan offered a blessing in both Apache and English. Words bridging old divides. May this place stand for justice, he said, where all find welcome at the water. Dylan felt Mila's hand slip into his, warm and sure. Luke worked nearby, shoulders straight with renewed purpose. The afternoon light streamed through fresh-cut windows, touching the Bible on its shelf. Standing before the leaning cross at twilight, Dylan whispered his thanks. Gideon grazed peacefully in the yard, water glinting in the trough. The deserted cabin he'd found that desperate day had changed everything, bringing him family, love, and a community rooted in faith and fairness. If today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here where love speaks softly and stays.